The global financial clock just crossed a point of no return. For decades, you've been told the US dollar is unbreakable, stronger than ever, the safest place on earth. But here's the contradiction nobody likes to sit with. Every dominant reserve currency in modern history collapses on a schedule, not by accident. And the dollar just entered the danger zone. This isn't abstract economics. This connects directly to your savings, your cost of living, your future buying power. If this system cracks, it doesn't ask permission before it hits you. The most unsettling part isn't that something might go wrong, it's that the warning signs always look identical right before it does. Massive debt, aggressive money creation, quiet loss of confidence masked as stability. Most people don't notice because collapse never starts with panic. It starts with reassurance. And that leads to a question you should be asking right now. If past currency empires didn't survive this stage, why would this one be different? What's happening now didn't begin this year, and it didn't begin with a crisis headline. The core event is simple on the surface. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. That role gave the United States unmatched advantages: cheaper borrowing, global demand for its currency, and the ability to run deficits without immediate consequences. But the material you provided makes one thing clear. This dominance came with a built-in flaw. To supply dollars to the world, the US had to spend more than it produced year after year. That imbalance wasn't temporary, it became permanent. Over time, production gave way to consumption, trade surpluses turned into chronic deficits, and debt filled the gap. This isn't a one-off policy mistake. It's a structural pattern that has ended every reserve currency before it. But here's where the story widens. This isn't just about America mismanaging money. It's about a system that forces the issuer of the global currency to hollow itself out to keep the system alive. And that raises the real question, is the dollar failing because of bad decisions or because the role itself is designed to fail? The strongest claim in the material is also the most uncomfortable one. The dollar isn't weakening by mistake. It's being consumed by its own design. The mechanism has a name, and it's not controversial. Triffin's paradox. To keep the world supplied with dollars, the United States has to run permanent trade deficits. That means importing more than it exports, paying with newly created currency. The turning point came in 1971 when the US closed the gold window and detached the dollar from any physical restraint. From that moment on, the system shifted. A $100 bill cost only cents to print, but the rest of the world had to exchange real labor, real energy, real goods to obtain it. That wasn't a glitch. It was the operating model. And for decades, it worked because foreign countries recycled those dollars back into US debt. But notice what's missing from that arrangement. It only functions as long as others keep buying the debt. The material points out the scale of the imbalance clearly. Hundreds of billions in annual trade deficits sustained not by productivity, but by confidence. Once that confidence cracks, the math turns vicious. And here's the part most people overlook. When the world stops funding the deficit, the issuer is forced to fund itself. That's not stability. That's the beginning of acceleration. This is where the story stops being theoretical and starts looking familiar. When reserve currencies enter decline, they don't disappear quietly. They compensate. Historically, economic dominance fades first, then financial leverage stretches thinner, and finally power is enforced through other means. The material draws a clear parallel here. After major wars, Britain didn't lose its empire overnight. It printed, it borrowed, it devalued. In 1949 and again in 1967, the pound collapsed suddenly, wiping out purchasing power in real time. What had been unthinkable became normal almost overnight. The same normalization is happening now, just at a larger scale. Trillions created with keystrokes, deficits framed as manageable, debt treated as abstract, But here's the part nobody says out loud. These actions aren't signs of strength, they're signals of adaptation under pressure. The system isn't being repaired, it's being stretched. And every stretch reduces trust a little more. What once required extraordinary justification is now routine. Emergency measures become permanent tools. That's how late-stage systems behave. Not with explosions, but with quiet acceptance. And once that acceptance sets in, escalation doesn't announce itself. It just arrives faster than expected. The evidence becomes harder to ignore when you compare what's being said with what's being done. Publicly, officials describe inflation as controlled, manageable, even temporary. Privately, the numbers tell a different story. The material shows debt crossing levels once considered unthinkable, with interest payments alone rivaling major government budgets. To keep that structure standing, the central bank steps in as buyer of last resort, absorbing government debt with newly created money. This isn't a theory, it's an action loop. Print to cover deficits, borrow to pay interest, repeat. And here's where the contradiction locks in. If inflation were truly temporary, there would be no need for this scale of intervention. Yet the interventions keep growing, purchasing power drops, prices reset higher, wages lag behind. Notice what never appears in official language: an exit. There's no roadmap back to restraint, because restraint would expose the debt instantly. This is the line that permanently changes how the system looks. Inflation isn't a side effect anymore, it's the mechanism. A slow transfer from currency holders to debt holders. Once you see that, the reassurance stops sounding calming and starts sounding strategic. Now watch how fast the pressure stacks. First, debt servicing costs overtake priorities that once defined national power. Interest payments begin competing with defense, infrastructure, basic governance. Second, the central bank loses room to maneuver, raise rates, and the debt breaks. Cut rates, and inflation reignites. Every option feeds a different crisis. Third, confidence starts leaking sideways, not in headlines but in behavior. Foreign buyers slow down. Alternatives are explored quietly. Hedging replaces loyalty. None of this happens in isolation. Each move forces the next. The system reacts, not plans. And the pace accelerates because delays become unaffordable. This is what late-stage instability looks like. Not chaos, but compression. Decisions are made faster, with fewer good options, under louder pressure. What used to take decades now unfolds in years, sometimes months. And here's the unsettling part. Once momentum replaces control, intent matters less than direction. The machine keeps moving because stopping it would be worse, which leaves one unavoidable question hanging in the air. What happens if this continues? At this point, the consequences stop living in spreadsheets and start showing up in your daily life. You feel it when groceries cost more but packages get smaller. When rent resets higher but wages don't. When savings that once felt safe quietly lose reach every month. This isn't ideology, it's arithmetic. Inflation acts like a silent tax, and it hits hardest where there's no room to maneuver. Fixed incomes, hourly wages, small businesses absorbing higher costs without pricing power. The material makes clear that this isn't accidental damage. It's how debt-heavy systems relieve pressure without saying so out loud. Value is transferred slowly, invisibly, until people adapt out of necessity. And notice the psychological shift that comes with it. Short-term thinking replaces planning. Risk feels normal. Speculation starts to look like survival. That's how ordinary behavior changes under monetary stress. Not because people are reckless, but because the ground keeps moving under their feet. If this pattern feels familiar, you're not imagining it. Others are sensing it too, even if they don't use the same words. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. The reason this keeps happening isn't greed, incompetence, or bad personalities. It's leverage baked into the system. When a currency becomes global, its issuer gains power far beyond borders, but that power depends entirely on belief, trust that the money holds value, trust that rules won't change overnight, trust that access won't be weaponized. The material explains how this trust is maintained not just through economics, but through incentives and fear. Allies are rewarded with access, rivals are punished through sanctions, asset freezes, exclusion from payment systems. Over time, money stops being neutral and becomes a tool of control. That works until it doesn't. Because once currency is used as a weapon, everyone starts looking for armor. Alternatives don't emerge out of ideology, they emerge out of self-preservation. And here's the unsettling insight mainstream coverage avoids. The more aggressively power is enforced, the faster parallel systems form. Not to replace the system overnight, but to escape its reach. That's the mechanism at work now. Quiet diversification, redundant payment rails, assets that can't be frozen with a keystroke. This isn't rebellion, it's adaptation. And once adaptation spreads, the old system doesn't collapse instantly. It just stops being the only game in town. From here, the path forward splits, and neither direction is clean. One path is managed decline. The system holds together through coordination, capital controls, new instruments, and constant intervention. Volatility becomes permanent. Crises are contained but never resolved. Trust erodes slowly, then suddenly. The dollar remains dominant but no longer unquestioned. Power fragments, rules bend, stability becomes conditional. The other path is disorder. A shock hits the wrong pressure point, a dead event, a currency break, a geopolitical escalation that forces financial lines to snap. In that scenario, confidence doesn't fade, it flips. Capital rushes for exits at once. Systems designed for flow seize up under speed. Neither outcome requires a single dramatic decision. Momentum does most of the work. And that's what makes this phase dangerous. Everyone is reacting to everyone else, watching signals instead of fundamentals. Moves are preemptive. Hedging becomes acceleration. And here's the key detail. You don't get to choose which path unfolds. You only get to watch which one starts forming first. And the early signals are already moving. Here's the part that ties everything together. This story isn't really about the dollar. It's about what happens when a system built on trust runs on momentum instead. Reserve currencies don't fail because people stop believing all at once. They fail because belief becomes optional. When alternatives exist, when exits are tested, when rules feel flexible depending on who you are, the spell breaks quietly. What you're watching now is not collapse, but transition. A long shift from a single center of gravity to something messier, more fragmented, less predictable. History shows that this phase is where most people lose context, not money first. They anchor to what worked before, while the structure underneath changes shape. The advantage doesn't go to the loudest voices or the boldest predictions. It goes to those who understand the direction before the headline confirms it. This isn't the end of the story. It's the hinge. And what comes next will reshape how power, money, and security interact for decades. If you want to keep tracking where this leads, stay with this channel. We're just getting to the deeper layer.